The meeting was arranged through a refugee advocacy organization in London, a quiet gathering in a community center in East London, where Ronaldo had agreed to listen to stories from families who had fled conflicts around the world. And among the dozen people who had come to share their experiences was Mahmoud Al-Zahra, a 34-year-old engineer from Gaza whose journey to safety had taken 3 years and cost time everything except his determination to rebuild his life and his commitment to ensuring that his children could grow up without the constant fear of violence that had defined his own childhood and young adulthood in a place where normalcy was interrupted by airstrikes and where dreams were always conditional on survival through conflicts that seemed to cycle endlessly without resolution or hope for lasting peace. Mahmoud spoke carefully and quietly, his English accented but precise as he described a life that had been repeatedly shattered and rebuilt, starting with his childhood during the Second Intifada when his school was bombed while he was in mathematics class, killing 3 of his classmates and teaching him at age 12 that education was a privilege that could be taken away without warning by people who viewed Palestinian children's learning as a threat to their own security, and continuing through his university years when he studied engineering by candlelight during power outages that lasted for days. Determined to acquire skills that could help rebuild infrastructure that was destroyed faster than it could be repaired by communities that were trapped between impossible choices and deteriorating conditions. The story that captured Ronaldo's complete attention began with Mahmoud's description of his wedding day in 2018, a celebration that had been planned for months, despite the restrictions that made even basic preparations complicated by shortages of electricity, clean water, and construction materials that were needed for the small apartment where he and his bride Layla hoped to start their family, and how their reception had been interrupted by air raid sirens that forced guests to take shelter in basements while fighter jets flew overhead, transforming what should have been the happiest day of their lives into another reminder that joy in Gaza was always temporary and always subject to interruption by violence that came without warning and often without clear military justification that could explain why wedding celebrations posed threats that required immediate military response. Layla had been 6 months pregnant with their first child when the 2021 bombing campaign began. Mahmoud explained, and they had spent 11 days in their apartment's stairwell because it was the only space that offered any protection from airstrikes that destroyed entire buildings without advance warning. And during those 11 days of terror, Layla had gone into premature labor brought on by stress and fear. Their son Omar, born in a hospital that was operating without electricity, while bombs fell close enough to shake the walls and make doctors worry that they might need to evacuate patients who couldn't be moved safely during medical emergencies that required equipment and supplies that were increasingly difficult to obtain due to blockades that prevented essential medical materials from reaching healthcare facilities. The details that followed painted a picture of life under siege that was difficult for someone who had never experienced such conditions to fully comprehend. Daily routines organized around air raid schedules and electricity rations, children who played games about hiding from drones and who drew pictures of bombed buildings because that was the landscape they knew. Families who slept in shifts, so someone would always be awake to listen for warnings that might provide a few seconds to reach shelter before missiles destroyed homes where people had been sleeping peacefully moments before violence arrived to shatter lives that had been carefully rebuilt after previous rounds of destruction and loss. Mahmoud's voice remained steady as he described the decision to leave Gaza, a choice that felt like abandoning family and community, but had become necessary when it became clear that their son Omar was developing psychological trauma from constant exposure to violence, nightmares, and panic attacks that affected a 2-year-old child who should have been learning to walk and talk, instead of learning to recognize the sounds of different types of aircraft and to run for shelter when warning sirens interrupted playtime. And when doctors explained that Omar's development was being seriously affected by chronic stress that could have lifelong consequences if they remained in an environment where violence was normalized, and safety was never guaranteed for more than a few hours at a time. The escape from Gaza had required 2 years of applications and interviews and payments to officials who controlled permits and border crossings, Mahmoud explained. Bureaucratic processes that were designed to discourage people from leaving, while creating opportunities for corruption that forced desperate families to choose between spending money on basic necessities or on bribes that might eventually lead to permission to seek safety elsewhere. And during those 2 years of waiting, they had survived 2 more bombing campaigns that had destroyed their apartment building and forced them to live with relatives whose own homes were overcrowded with extended family members who had also lost everything to airstrikes that seemed to target civilian infrastructure more than military installations. The journey to Europe had been dangerous and expensive, involving boat trips across the Mediterranean that killed hundreds of people who were seeking the same safety that Mahmoud's family had eventually found. And when they finally reached London, they had arrived with nothing except the clothes they were wearing and the hope that their son could grow up without learning to distinguish between different types of explosions or to sleep through the sound of fighter jets overhead. But the psychological scars remained. Omar still waking up screaming from nightmares about planes and bombs, despite being in a country where such violence was unimaginable to most children his age. Ronaldo listened without interrupting, his own experiences of childhood poverty and struggle seeming insignificant compared to what Mahmoud and his family had endured. And when Mahmoud finished his story by explaining that he was now working as a delivery driver because his engineering credentials weren't recognized in the UK, and that he was taking night classes to qualify for professional work, while Layla cleaned offices to help support their family and pay for Omar's therapy sessions that were slowly helping their son recover from trauma that no child should ever have to experience. Ronaldo understood that this was not just one family's story, but a window into suffering that affected millions of people whose voices were rarely heard by people with the power to make changes that could improve their circumstances. The questions that Ronaldo asked revealed his genuine desire to understand not just what had happened to Mahmoud's family, but what could be done to help other families who were facing similar circumstances. And when Mahmoud explained that the greatest need was not charity, but opportunity, chances for skilled refugees to use their education and experience to rebuild their lives with dignity rather than dependence, Ronaldo began to see how his influence could be used to create systematic changes that would benefit entire communities, rather than just providing temporary assistance to individual families who needed long-term solutions to problems that were much larger than any single person's circumstances. The foundation that emerged from that conversation became one of Ronaldo's most important charitable initiatives, a comprehensive program designed to help skilled refugees obtain professional credentials, start businesses, and rebuild careers that had been interrupted by conflicts that forced them to abandon everything they had worked to achieve. And the program's first beneficiaries included Mahmoud, who was able to complete his engineering qualifications and eventually establish his own consulting firm that specialized in designing infrastructure for post-conflict reconstruction. Work that allowed him to use his professional skills while contributing to solutions for problems he understood personally, rather than theoretically. Omar's recovery became a symbol of the program's broader success, a child who had learned to fear the sky, gradually becoming comfortable with airplanes and loud noises, as therapy and stability allowed him to develop normally, despite the traumatic start to his life. And his progress reminded everyone involved that healing was possible when people were given safety, support, and time to recover from experiences that had threatened to destroy their faith in the possibility of normal life, where children could play without fear, and families could plan for futures that weren't constantly threatened by violence beyond their control. The scholarship program that the foundation established provided educational opportunities for refugee children who had missed years of schooling due to conflicts and displacement, ensuring that a generation of young people who had been forced to flee their homes wouldn't also lose their futures to educational disruption that could limit their potential for the rest of their lives. And many of these students went on to become doctors, engineers, teachers, and entrepreneurs who contributed to their new communities, while maintaining connections to their countries of origin that they hoped to help rebuild when peace finally made return possible. The advocacy work that grew out of Mahmoud's story extended beyond refugee assistance to include support for peace initiatives that address the root causes of displacement rather than just treating its symptoms. And Ronaldo used his platform to speak about the human cost of conflicts that were often discussed in political or strategic terms that obscured the individual suffering of families who lost everything to violence that served political purposes they had no part in creating, but paid the highest price for experiencing. And his advocacy helped humanize refugee issues for audiences who might otherwise view displacement as an abstract problem, rather than a crisis affecting real people, with names and stories and dreams that deserve protection and support. Years later, when Mahmoud had established a successful engineering firm that employed other skilled refugees and contributed to infrastructure projects across Europe, when Omar had grown into a healthy teenager who played football and dreamed of becoming a doctor, when hundreds of other refugee families had been helped to rebuild their lives through programs inspired by one man's courage in sharing his story with someone who had the power to transform individual testimony into systematic change. Ronaldo would reflect that listening to Mahmoud had taught him that true leadership required not just achieving personal success, but using that success to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard, and to create opportunities for people whose potential was being wasted by circumstances beyond their control. The lesson that emerged from Mahmoud's story was that every refugee was someone's son or daughter, someone's mother or father, someone who had once lived a normal life with dreams and plans and hopes for the future before violence forced them to abandon everything familiar in search of safety. That should be every human being's right, rather than a privilege available only to those lucky enough to be born in countries where peace was taken for granted, and where children could grow up without learning to distinguish between the sounds of different types of military aircraft, or to sleep through explosions that other people's children would never have to hear.